We are, Jared and I are excited to have Dr. Mitch Pavao-Zuckerman give our seminar today. Most of you all probably know Mitch. Mitch's lab focuses on how humans interact with the environment and how they change ecological functions, mostly working in urban systems, both in the DMV and Arizona. And you might not have seen Mitch lately until this semester because he's been on sabbatical, which I think is going to be a good chunk of what his seminar is today. So yeah, I hand it over.
Thanks, Travis. So I had suggested that I was able to do sort of like a what I did on my sabbatical kind of talk if there was an open slot, and didn't expect there actually to be one, especially so soon in the semester. I wanted this to be something more than just a slideshow of things, but I stayed in some cool places in Arizona and worked in some cool places, so I wanted to share some of that with you, and then also have an opportunity to share some new research that's going on that sort of overlapped that and came out with that. So I tried to think of a way to umbrella everything together, and that's the social ecological idea. You'll see that sort of people and nature and design are kind of connected throughout the different things that I'm going to talk about today. Want to do a quick land acknowledgement to recognize that the work that I've done here and in Arizona is on unceded territories of different indigenous peoples, here in the Piscataway people, and in Tucson, the O'odham and the Yaqui. And if you're not familiar with this project, I'd like to bring your attention to this website, landgrabu.org. It talks about the special role that land grant universities have in relation to properties and lands that were taken from Native tribes, and how that still supports our ability to do our jobs nowadays, and gives us some food for thought about how we sort of pay that back. All right, so outline for the talk today. Again, I'm going to talk largely about where I did my sabbatical in Arizona, and talk a little bit about sort of working and living in the past, the present, and the future. I will spend some time talking about the property that we stayed on, which is called University Indian Ruins. Gives you a hint at the past part. I was housed in a department that was in a new building, LEED certified, platinum. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the cool things that that building had, and then move on to some of the work that I did during sabbatical or that is still ongoing. Part of that was designing and working on a honors class on science fiction in the future, and some research going into the future, design for an agrivoltaic system, which we'll get into what that means. So moving from the past into the present to the future. So if you're not familiar with this idea of a social ecological framework, I know some of you have taken classes with me that cover this. This is really simply the idea that to understand environmental problems and environmental systems, we really need to look at them as a holistic combination of the social and the ecological and environmental factors that bring them together and cause them to have the patterns and the process and the dynamics that we see in them. I tell students in my class that once I started reading this literature, and perhaps for some of them, when they start reading that literature, it's almost like drinking the Kool-Aid. And once you see this perspective, you can't unsee it. You see it everywhere. So as I was walking through these spaces in Arizona, that's where I sort of started filtering things together in my mind about what might link some of this together to be able to share with people. So for sabbatical, my wife and I were both able to align sabbaticals. She's a faculty and department head in anthropology. We spent the full spring semester in Tucson from mid-January to very end of May. We got to experience winter and spring in the desert, which is the best time to be there because that's when the wildflowers come out. We also got to see some snow, which was cool because our kids were totally bummed that they missed all the snow here. So we drove them up Mount Lemmon, hit the snow line, and they got to play around in the snow a little bit, which was fun. Other cool stuff, just to show you some of what I was doing there. a lot of great tacos. Tucson is known as like a UN gastronomical city of recognition, and it has earned it. The Northern Lights that were appearing out actually made it down to us. These were pictures that I took on site, and I got to play around with some photography and some light images with plants and stuff, taking advantage of all the sun that we had out there. So a lot of fun out there. We were living in a really unique property. How many of you have been to Tucson before? So almost half of you have been there. This is a good aerial view of the city itself, and you can see that one of the unique things about Tucson is that it's got 2 national parks on either side. So Saguaro National Park is bisected by the city, and the city is ringed by mountain chains. So there's mountains all around, which is great for recreation. It's also great ecologically. Like anything that we know about elevation gradients, about transitions between habitats and elevation, came from work that was done out here, which is really cool. This is where University of Arizona is, close to downtown. And I was staying out on the east side of town. Just sort of to zoom in, you can see a couple of dry rivers come together on the north part of town, setting sort of the environment of where the people were living at this site before they put neighborhoods up in it. Zooming in a little bit more, this is the property that we were staying on. University Indian Ruins is a 14-acre patch of desert that's never been turned into housing development. It was set aside because even back before the 1940s, people recognized and knew that there was significant archaeological remains here. So the owners of the landscape around that turned it into neighborhood, turned it into the golf course that you can see there, set aside this space and worked with the city to turn it into a preserve. And then over time, it was donated to the university. The university runs it as a field station for students to do classwork at, but it also runs a sabbatical stay program. So my wife applied for that, and we got free housing in this great 1930s adobe house out on the property. Really cool. So traditional, like Southwestern design, thick walls, really cool and cold inside. They had air conditioning units. We didn't really need them. It got hot towards the end of our stay, like we hit 100-degree day. But it was really designed to hold the coolness inside of it. So the house is right here. Some of the other buildings are a laboratory for the students to use. And then there's also another house where there's a graduate student who's a full-time caretaker, because this is it's an ongoing archaeological preserve. So you can't go in there and take stuff, but lots of people in the neighborhood like to walk dogs around the perimeter. So part of our job also was to just make sure people weren't coming through the fence that weren't supposed to be there. Archaeological site is out in here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through to show you some of the cool stuff that we see out there. But as you can imagine, you've got a couple of really interesting environments coming together. You've got the washes that are nice corridors for animals to come through. You've got this great huge space in the middle of this suburban sprawl of Tucson. But you get to see lots of cool animals. So we set up wildlife cameras and saw all kinds of stuff. That bobcat is actually like on our side of the fence, so like in the yard where our house was, which was kind of cool. We found on site an active coyote den. Hard to get a camera near it, but we were able to get some nice rear end shots of the coyotes. I'm not a wildlife person, so this is the best I could do. But the coyotes were, I don't know if we have sound on here. Do we have sound on here? Maybe not. Thanks. That's up. Oh well. So that would have been the sound of a pack of coyotes like right outside the door. They would just come and visit and just go crazy, and it was really loud. Let's see. This is an aerial view that one of the cool things that they can do at the site is teach archaeology students how to use drones. So that was one of the courses that was out there. So I was getting to talk to them about sort of how they could monitor soil moisture and think about differences that you might see in patterns. But again, here's the house that we're in, and you can kind of get a sense of some topography in here. There's a little bit of a rise where some of the structure was that people were living on. So University Indian Ruins is the remains of what they call a classic period Hohokam village that was occupied around 1150 to 1450 AD. This was a structure that was on a mound that was built up, and a set of earthen walls were put in to help retain that soil as they built it up. On top of that structure, there would have been some kind of building, some sort of house, but around the elevated part throughout the rest of the property, there would have been like pit houses and other kinds of living structures. So the mound would have been used maybe for ceremonies or important people, and then everyone else sort of like lived around that space, which is kind of neat. There were also remains of a defensive wall found around, which also I'll show you a picture of in a bit. But this gives you a sense of what the excavations look like. This dig, I think, happened up in this spot, and they found bison bone in there, which is kind of unique for that part of the Southwest. They do a lot of public archaeology as well, so we had to like entertain people as they came in. Stuff for like visiting neighbors from the neighborhood would come in for archaeology days. The house itself is also preserved because the house was built by the Works Progress Administration. So when they tried to first preserve the site, it was all done through the WPA, and now there's a whole nother level of preservation on top of that. You can't modify the structure in certain ways. You can't do a lot of change to it. So it's pretty much what people had back then, like no dishwasher. So our kids learned what dishwashing is like, which is great. So in this village around the site, 50 to 250 people, they estimate, live there at any given time. They were likely seasonal, so during the winter time, they would come together and stay close to the mound. When they would be out hunting, they would disperse away a little bit. They were also agriculturalists, so there were fields nearby that they were growing the Three Sisters on. There was a river nearby to get water. Lots of different sort of life ways that they had. This is a sense of what that platform mound would have or could have looked like. A recreation of the defensive wall with a mound, again, that's built up, earthen packed in with a structure on top, really thick adobe, just like we have in the more modern building. Perhaps there were some wooden structures built on top with some sort of like grass roofing. And this gives you a sense, here we are up on top of the mound itself. You can see the house is down below. So it's maybe 15 feet elevated above sort of ground level out there. Really cool. So one of the things we're doing is looking for artifacts and potsherds, which is evidence of what people were doing. So this is an artist's recreation of a similar type of village from the Southwest. They would have had rooftop entrances into lots of the buildings rather than front doorways for defensive purposes. But again, you can see there would have been building structures, there would have been outbuildings, and then fields that were moving out towards the water. So they're in a spot where they can take advantage of their location environmentally. Also defensively, it allowed them to look over the whole valley. So if you look at this picture now, there's lots of tall trees in the landscape. Those were planted by people over the last 100, 150 years. When people were living on the mound site, it would have just been low-statured shrubs, and you would have been able to see for miles out to the next village, which would have been in the mountains kind of off to the west. Great.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Did they know who they were defending against? They obviously were worried about some other people. So they're indigenous, the other people were indigenous.
Correct.
The people were pushing people around.
Right. So there was a lot of evidence of interactions between different groups, and that's over time. So again, they're living here for at least on the mound for 300-400 years. There's a lot of cultural and societal change that happens, especially towards the end of that time period. We know that the Southwest got a lot drier, evidence of sort of environmental stress that led to socioeconomic and political stress as well. So this is what the ground looks like out there. Every little piece of thing here that looks like a rock in that particular picture is a piece of pottery sherd. It's littered everywhere. You cannot take a step without seeing something cool. These are just a few examples of stuff that we found, sort of like the really interesting things. The rules are you can't take stuff with you. The rules that we had for the kids and people that were visiting us was you stop where you are, pick it up, and you can't move because you have to put it back kind of like where you found it. So if they find something cool and want us to identify it for them, they got to shout and we'll come over and see it. So we're looking at like chunks of pottery. You can almost see there's like a rim to this piece. So that was perhaps a piece of a plate that was painted on both sides. This is a spool for making thread out of cotton that they would have been growing. This is a broken piece of a mano from a mano and metate that they would have used to grind up corn. Those are rabbit bones that we found that were probably archaeological, but there's bunnies everywhere, so it's hard to tell if they're archaeological or not, just bleached. But archaeologists who work with this stuff can identify when these were painted. They have guides that will tell you like this was a something period, whatever, and it was done from 1150 to 1175. And they know where it was made. They know how those traditions were passed from place to place. This particular piece, I think, was painted in Phoenix and made its way down to Tucson archaeologically in prehistory. So there's trade involved going back and forth, just kind of interesting. The reason why we find fields of this stuff is partly because it's a site, but also because in some areas there's animal activity that would go in and burrow and just dig and just kick chunks of pottery out of the ground. So some really cool evidence of trade that we were finding even on the ground. And I know about this because this is some of the stuff that my wife actually studies. So we are located here, the Hohokam people. We found one intact projectile point, a little tiny obsidian flake and a chunk of like trash of, they call it decoupage. It's the stuff that you knock off of the rock to turn into the thing. That obsidian does not exist in Tucson. That obsidian only comes from here. So that was traded in. They found evidence of macaw wings that were also traded in. We found these shell bracelets that only come from the Gulf of California. So evidence of long distance trade, hundreds and hundreds of miles, were part of these people's socio-ecology. And it's just sitting there on the ground. Really amazing stuff. Like you pick these things up and like somebody had a little paintbrush and hundreds of years ago, they were making these little lines, and now I'm holding it and looking at it, and it's mind-blowing and awe-striking. So this is a look at some of the structures that are left behind. So again, walls that are packed in, really tight earth, really thick to hold back the soil or really thick to hold heat in the buildings or to keep the heat out. This is after a rain, and you can see the pattern of the walls in the ground because they were packed so tight and they're made with soil particles that are holding more water. So you can actually see that as you sort of look over the landscape. You can see the outline of stuff, which is kind of cool. When I was faculty at Arizona, I used this site as a place to do research because it's preserved. There's a lot of biological soil crust there, which is really cool. You don't see that in lots of places in urbanized spots. So we were able to look at the influence on urbanization, on the physiology of these crusts, and found that they were photosynthesizing like a lot slower than their same species of crust that you would find outside of town. Really neat. Big implications for nutrient cycling because of the little bit of nutrients that go through these systems, any photosynthetic change is going to have a big impact on all the rest of the cycles. All right, so that's a look at the living in the past part. Really amazing. I've got like hundreds of pictures of different pieces of pottery that I could spend like forever showing you, but I'm not going to do that. I was visiting faculty in the Department of Geography and Development and Environment, which is housed in a building called ENR2, Environment and Natural Resources. This building houses, that department houses their natural sciences, their natural resources program, their climate institute, a few other departments. And it's a building that was put they started building it when I left there, so it was brought online in about 2018, 2019, $75 million to put in a LEED Platinum certified building that's designed to reduce energy consumption, conserve water, and also have a longer lifespan by using sort of high quality building components. This is what it looks like on the outside from the street. So there's lots of shade built around the building. So there's like a shell of shade structures that are built over the glass windows to try to reduce the heat input to the building, which is a large part of the design. I'm standing here in the courtyard of it at the ground level, and you can get a sense of what this looks like. It was designed so that on the inside, it is replicating a slot canyon like you would have in the Southwest. So lots of stratigraphy and topography, different plants that are growing at different levels, representing how you would see that change as you were moving through a real canyon. Some of that is aesthetic, but some of that also helps meet some of the LEED requirements that they were trying to make. So part of what they're doing is water harvesting. They have a huge underground tank with a 52,000 gallon storage capacity to grab water from any rain that falls, especially in the summer. It also pulls in condensate. But that open courtyard reduces the amount of space in the building that has to be air conditioned or conditioned. So it reduces the energy demand. But because it's shaded throughout the day, especially as you go into these different levels, there's lots of little nooks to sit and meet with people. There's a lot of usable outdoor space. Might be harder to do here. We'd have to think about like what that kind of design would be like. But that design, the planting of plants, creates a lot of different microclimates that are really nice to sort of be in. And they also, again, use shading to minimize the exposure to the south and to the sun that's coming in. On the top of the building, they've put in a green roof, which helps with stormwater. It helps with insulation. It's also done in a way that's experimental, so it's modular. They can move plants in and out and see what's desert appropriate green roof plants, for example. They have all kinds of stuff throughout the building for water conservation, dual flush toilets, which are like all over the place in the Southwest and should be like standard everywhere, but they're not. Showers that are handicap accessible, so you could bike in and shower and clean off if you want to in the 100-something degree summer heat. You still don't have to give up that sort of lifestyle and energy consumption choice if you don't want to. You're not going to hear this because it doesn't play sound, but maybe you'll see it. One part of the design was that canyon effect allows the air currents to get pulled into the building and then shot up from the canyon. So it's another way of cooling the building without using air conditioning. So standing at the side of that, you can just feel the air sort of getting yanked in past you to cool everything off. It's really amazing how they designed it. All right, so that's a quick look at where I worked. Really neat building. They're like coming out of COVID much more than we have been, so it was empty. I had like the floor almost all to myself most of the time, which was kind of weird. But what did I work on while I was there? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a science fiction class that I'm designing that is also feeding into the social ecological research that I do. So about a year and a half ago, I applied to be part of a new cluster with the Honors College on science and fiction that Kimberly Coles put together. She's in the English department. And there's a group of us that are teaching different aspects of this sort of combination of how we use storytelling in science. So Kim, for example, is teaching a course on how race is constructed and how we tell stories about race. Bryn is doing a course on sort of how medical illustrations aren't always the truth. So we might hear the story that like Michelangelo and Leonardo did all of these sort of cadaver works to represent the body as it actually is. Total BS. They represented what they wanted to. So that's what her class is about. My class is going to be looking at how we can use science and fiction as a way to think about the environmental future. So I'm bringing together science fiction literature, planning literature, literature on sort of stakeholder workshops to teach students about how we can sort of use this as a lens to think about the future. One of the things that science fiction does, as Margaret Atwood, who's a really great predictor of like where things are going in not great ways, tells us that not real can tell us about real. It's a bit effectively like a lens for us to look at how we're going to deal with things. So science fiction is a way for us to think about how technology is going to operate in the context of our societies, how society is going to respond to environmental change or climate change, how the technologies we might develop might emerge and give us different sort of social outcomes. It also lets us think about how we do world making, which is part of what we're trying to do here in environmental science and technology, right? We're trying to think about how to get to a better world. So that's a lot of what this science fiction work can do, is help us think about using storytelling as a way to get to that point. And through that, it informs futures thinking. How do we get from here to some place that's more sustainable, more resilient? So in the class, I'm going to use a variety of different literature, short stories, novels, perhaps movies. Have any of you read any of these before? A couple. So Parable of the Sower, I put that one off for a long time and just read it this year because it actually starts taking place a few months ago. It's a brutal book.
It's amazing.
It's amazing though, right? So one of the things that both The Year of the Flood by Margaret Atwood and Octavia Butler do is ask us to think about what's going to happen when or if society starts to collapse because climate change is too much of a stress for us. So they let us see different ways that we think about, in Parable of the Sower, for example, climate change is in the background. Things are warmer, the weather patterns are different, food production is kind of crashing. So how do we help each other when a lot of people aren't helping each other, without giving too much away in that book? Both books actually think about like new ways of bringing spirituality and religion together. Margaret Atwood has like a whole CD of hymns that were written by a cult that exists in her book. Really interesting stuff. Kim Stanley Robinson and Jeff Vandermeer are like also sort of opposites of how to think about climate. Kim Stanley Robinson is kind of really like wonky when he writes about science. He's very into like technology and policy and politics and management, giving you like the title, The Ministry of the Future. Hummingbird Salamander, Jeff is like, he writes like weird science or weird ecology, like really strange sort of like things breaking down and we don't really know how to interact with it. There's a lot of interesting resilience technologies in works like Ministry for the Future, socially not great, bordering on ecofascism, right? So we solve problems, but we create other problems. So it's, when we start reading things like this, it gives students a lens and a way to think about how we can kind of make better or different choices. Science fiction also lets us ask questions like, what if? Like most of you hope maybe are familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Thanos does this thing where he snaps his fingers, gets rid of half of living organisms to deal with overpopulation. We can ask the question, and I sort of teased this in my intro ecology class, what would happen if we lost half living organisms? And it lets you think about like, what's the implications of that, but also, what do we mean by that? Like, does that mean half of my gut flora is gone. And what would that mean for people and for medicine? What would it mean if we lose things at the top of the food web or at the base of the food web? What does it mean if we lose like colonial organisms versus unicellular organisms, that sort of thing? What are the feedbacks that come through it? So it allows us to ask these kind of interesting what if questions. So I'll do exercises like that with students. For my own research program, I spent a lot of time reading through the journal Futures and other journals and a couple of books to think about how science fiction is used by people that do public engagement, stakeholder engagement as a way to think about what those futures will be like, to do scenario development, basically. Rather than just going in and saying, what are the scenarios we want, we try to use specific, like science fiction prototyping. There's specific techniques that we can use to get people to tell you stories or draw you stories about what that future is going to look like. And then when you get those future visions, we can backcast and say, all right, what's the pathways we have to go through to get to that sustainable future? Maybe it's coastal resilience question, or maybe it's dealing with heat stress and homeless people. How do you get to that point once you figure out what that future is going to look like? So a lot of fun reading science fiction. That's part of the reason why I want to teach this class, so I can like mix hobby and work. Great strategy if you can do it. But it leads me to the last part of what I'm going to talk about, which is this newer research thread that my group is taking on agrivoltaics, which is really studying sort of like ecology and design of the future. So if you're not familiar with it, agrivoltaics is this idea that we can co-locate agricultural production and photovoltaic systems, perhaps creating benefits across the food, energy, water spectrum. The idea being that perhaps the panels provide some environmental benefit for the plants that are growing there. There's lots of studies that are showing maybe yes, maybe no, but this is sort of the object that we're talking about. I first got involved with this when I was working in Arizona. My friend Greg and I were asked by some people that were living near a solar field that the university had put in as a research site, if that solar field was creating an urban heat island effect, was adding all of this black surface to a tan desert, changing the albedo enough, adding surfaces that the heat would kind of build up on, that they would notice that. So we put sensors throughout the system, out to the natural desert, into the neighborhoods, and found, yeah, 3 to 4 degrees Celsius at night, this thing warms things up, not very far though. So we started thinking immediately, what could you do to fix that? And one thing that we knew was that in the desert, especially, transpiration, the latent heat flux that you get off of that ecosystem, as water evaporates, it cools things off a lot. So we started thinking, how can we grow plants near those panels to cool them off? We applied for a bunch of different grants and got rejected a lot of times because we talked about using it as a mine reclamation idea. We weren't working in mine reclamation. They didn't believe us that we could grow plants there. We tried to do the agronomic idea, but neither of us had ever done agronomy, so they didn't believe us that we could grow food crops under there. So we managed to convince some local solar providers to donate a lot of solar panels to Biosphere 2 when I was working there. Built a couple of demonstration sites, and actually we're one of the first groups to show that there is the potential for a win-win-win situation when you co-locate crops underneath panels. We were able to show that when you do this with certain vegetable crops, you are able to get greater amount of food production off the same patch just by sticking plants under panels. So again, remember, this is the Sonoran Desert. Very hot, very dry summers. Largely what that plant production is coming from is because you're shading them when the summer is really hot. You're also extending sort of the shoulders of the growing season. So actually for Tomatoes, we were able to get 2 crops sometimes off of the same field because we extended the growing season long enough. The panels changed the plant water use efficiency, partly because they were keeping more water under the soil, again, because they were shading those systems out. So that's what these soil moisture data are showing you. It varies from plant to plant, which is interesting. So we see big effects on water use efficiency for jalapenos, not a huge impact on their actual crop production. We measured physiological stuff on here, saw differences, which was interesting. But one of the cool things we saw was that the water coming off the plants actually cooled the panels enough that they had like a 5-6% increase in their efficiency. Because you drop the temperature that they're operating at and it gets closer to what they're actually designed for, which is really cool. So people see work like this and say, that's the silver bullet. That's going everywhere. And this is going to solve our problems, right? Maybe not. So we recently got a DOE grant to try to scale this up. So you notice that was like community garden, schoolyard garden scale, really small plots. We got a grant from DOE to do this at the megawatt scale, like the actual big solar field scale. Plans were to collect data while I was there. We didn't get site access approval until I was back here maybe 2 months later. It took months and months to get approval just to be able to go on location and do like pre-studies. But the idea here is that we're gonna grow tomatoes, we're gonna grow grasses that sheep can graze on, and look at what actually happens. Do we see the same effect at larger scales? Does that benefit scale up? Because the design is totally different. Instead of having a couple of panels that are open, that are open, that are open, now it's just these long rows to see if that works. We can do economic analysis to see what the outcome of that might be. Part of my role in this is working on the sort of stakeholder engagement, and that's where I get to bring in some of those ideas of sort of visioning and futures. So my partners have been doing interviews with farmers, with solar providers out there to see what they think of this. In the fall, we're gonna get back together with them and do a science policy dialogue at this farm to table dinner that we're gonna have. So we're gonna feed them food that was grown under the panels by one of those fancy gastronomic chefs from Tucson, really rough job. And we're going to do activities that lets us synthesize those interviews. So we'll bring together farmers, power providers, people that work in different sectors, and use like a collective visioning exercise to say, where do we want to go? Try to get a roadmap out of this. Now that we know a little bit about the science, we know a little bit about what they're thinking. So obviously, people are, again, seeing that this is a great idea. So in the state of Maryland, in other states throughout the Eastern Seaboard, people are seeing agrivoltaics as a promising solution to lots of challenges. Like, we maybe don't have to give up farmland if we can put panels scattered throughout it and maybe provide some energy at the same time that we are keeping that farmland in existence. So we don't have to go in and chop down native ecosystems, perhaps. Maryland has very ambitious renewable energy goals. By the year 2035, targets that we're probably not going to make, definitely by the year 2050 that we're trying to hit. To do this, the state estimates that we do have to put solar in agricultural settings. So how do we do this? So agrivoltaics is looked at as a solution to that land use conflict. It perhaps is going to help us solve other environmental challenges. Maybe as things get warmer and hotter, we're able to use those panels to buffer environments during climate change. Some of the work that I've been doing here recently has been funded by the Montgomery County Department of Environmental Protection and the Hughes Center for Agroecology. One of the things that it's allowed me to do is hire Dr. Jennifer Morash, who is spearheading a lot of this work, and it really wouldn't be possible without the work that she's been doing with stakeholders. We just finished a set of focus groups in Montgomery County to get a sense of like what people here think. Our goal is to find out what are some of the barriers that people have to saying yes to this as a technology in their farm or in the jurisdiction where they work. Our idea is to, again, use these sort of social science tools to understand what technological, what political, what economic, what scientific information people might be looking to change their minds or to make decisions regarding this. We've done a literature review, which again shows how quickly this is growing. This is 2019. Our paper came out right in 2018, 2019. You can see like a hyper exponential growth. My son was looking at this and he said something like, "There's a lot of literature being written." Like that was his data analysis. Despite all of this, people perceive that there's a lack of research. And part of that is because the research is coming from the wrong place, right? So the geographies where people are studying this are very limited. Europe is gung-ho on it. There are parts of the US that are putting out papers. But again, a research study in the arid Southwest or in the Midwest isn't going to tell us about how the system's going to operate here in Maryland. People here need to see how that's going to take place to make those decisions and decide if it's too risky to go ahead and do this, if it's going to cut their production enough that they're not going to be able to maintain their farming. So we're doing a bunch of focus groups. We're breaking things up by sectors. We're working or talking with farmers. We're talking with energy companies or consultants. We're talking with county government members and people that are either advocates or part of NGOs. Again, to ask them questions about what their perceptions of agrivoltaics are. How do they define it? What do they see as the benefits and what do they see as the obstacles? Are policies or the government affecting diffusion positively or negatively? Is it being pushed on you? We're asking in those different sectors, what are some of the implementation and logistical challenges that they're seeing as well? So again, we finished our last focus group Monday morning. Preliminary analysis. We haven't gone through and done content. We haven't done coding or anything like that. This is just me and Jennifer sitting and saying, what did you think? We've done a pre-survey where we give them maybe a dozen pictures of different agrivoltaic systems that are set up differently and say, is this agrivoltaics? And some of them are sneaky, like these are the same farm. And people will say that without some production underneath it, they don't think it's agrivoltaics. Most of the people that are doing these focus groups with us have familiarity with the idea. Maybe 2/3 have a positive view of it. So you can imagine not everybody thinks it's a great idea. Some people think it's being forced on them. Some people think it's too early to do anything. Again, this is showing you the survey results. Most people say, not agrivoltaics. This is only just because you can see the critters eating grass underneath it. Really quickly, some of the main themes that we see starting to bubble up in terms of opinions here. Most people feel like we don't know enough to make decisions about how this will impact Maryland. That's everybody from people in the government to the farmers to people from the solar companies. The systems that have grazing underneath them seem to be what people think are the most likely to be functional and operational here. Just growing grass, cool season grasses perhaps, might respond to the panels and you run sheep through them every now and then. We're starting to see the importance of a systems perspective, so people aren't necessarily just thinking about a farm or the panel on that farm. They're thinking about the sort of different scales that benefits might be applied at. They're thinking about the logistics of this. So are there power lines to take the energy that they're harvesting? How do you get labor to your farm if you're shifting the way that you're going to do your operation? So maybe you do have the ability to stick panels out. You do have the ability to run that energy to a high capacity line, but you've got no way to get people to you because all of the labor is somewhere else in the county. we also are starting to see that there are differing views on the role of zoning, the role of policies, the role of incentives, and a lot of that is because we don't know the economics yet. We don't know if it's going to work. So a lot of this is telling us we need to know more about what's going on before we start sort of jumping in gung-ho, even though in some systems it sounds like this is really going to be a profitable operation. All right, so we've built up this research consortium that is starting to think about this from different perspectives, ecologically, environmentally, but we also have people that work on law, that work on policy, that are coming at it from extension and engagement. And recently we've gotten a couple of pockets of money to be able to do some demonstrations locally at the Y and at Western Maryland Rec Center to see if it does impact or how it does impact crop production in Maryland, which is sort of like that missing main piece of information. From there, we can tell a lot of different things. This money just came online. We're still planning to see like what we're gonna do. Some of it will be like, how do we design the panels in the experiment? How do we select crops? What is the scale of this operation? A lot of that will be done with stakeholders. So again, the information we get is useful for them. So conclusions. Sabbatical is awesome. If you can take one, take it. I am so fortunate to be able to have people who can take care of my lab, who paid me to go hang out in the desert for 6 months so I could think about all of this cool stuff. Thanks for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions. And if not, I'll see you at the WAC. The WAC. The WAC. Thank you.
We've got 5 minutes, maybe let's take 2 and then we can move
On Zoom. There's a question on Zoom, maybe do that first.
Sure.
Yes, this is a question from Cassie. How do you foresee agrivoltaic technology coexisting with existing conservation agricultural practices, such as the planting of cover crops? Question. Are there limited use cases for what crops can be grown under these panels?
Yeah, those are really great questions and sort of open questions. I think one of the things that people are starting to investigate is not just what's the impact on the plants, but more of like a whole systems perspective. If you have these panels that are concentrating rainfall in certain spots, what is that going to do to infiltration? What is that going to do to soil carbon? We don't yet know really what different crops can do under these, and that's part of what we might be looking at. Marty.
So maybe big picture, and maybe you didn't know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
In the preliminary work that's been done, I'm sure people are doing economic assessments of this. What kind of proportion is the revenues coming from the photovoltaics versus the agriculture? Is the agriculture there kind of as a token, or is it actually?
That really depends on how you design it. So I hate having to give that answer, but that's sort of like the ecology answer is like it depends. It really depends on the context. Some systems where it's a lot of panels, it's a lot of energy. In some places it's designed differently. We've been talking in our focus groups about it's not necessarily an all or nothing thing at a farm. Like everybody's got a place where things don't grow as good. So what happens if you put the panels there and that energy is enough to like get you through blips in the market, to keep your farm more resilient, but you're still producing everywhere else and you don't have solar panels. We've got questions about whether certain entities would call that agrivoltaics. Some people say it has to be like production underneath a canopy, but I think that's one of the big open questions is sort of where those trade-offs come. And I think that's a lot of the decision-making too for people. Because it's not just the economics that's part of that, it's also like the cultural heritage and the viewshed of it as well, depending on how many panels you put out. Right.
Is anybody looking at going beyond either people doing hand labor under the panels or animals walking under the panels, so that limits the height of construction you have to do, as opposed to, tractor-drawn machines planting and harvesting?
Yes.
None of those pictures could I envision machinery running under
Right.
the system.
Right, and that's partly what I showed you, but there are systems where people are designing, instead of like a complete umbrella, you have row where you could run a tractor, row of panel, row where you could run a tractor. Or some systems are talking about, depending on what you're actually driving, racking things up high enough that you could move underneath, which causes all kinds of problems for wires and running into things and stuff. But people are thinking, there's a lot of engineering going on thinking about what that design could look like.
Can I do a quick follow-up? You did mention selective wavelength filters that allow photosynthetic light to go through, it's only a small part of the spectrum.
Did not mention that, but that's also something that people are looking at. One of the things we measured in our initial studies was that the panels only attenuate, it was like growing things in a greenhouse. But that was part of how we designed panels and the angles they were at and how much gap space there was.
We do have to vacate the room, so we can ask questions in the hall.
Thank you.